I have been told basically my whole life that I'm the loudest person in any room I'm in. And I never really got in trouble in school, but I am definitely the kid who always got sent home with that lovely note on my report card that said, loves to talk. Which, thank you for that kind introduction, Connie. That is probably why I had no trouble coming up with 30 minutes worth of things to say last week, because if you give me a microphone, I might just keep going forever, regardless of how much feedback it is giving. So it is a joy to get to be with y'all this morning. I'm so glad for the invitation to be with you. And when Jim sat down with me this week to share with me a little bit about the Challengers class, to give me a little bit of a primer on joining you this morning, he thought that it would be good for me to share a little bit about myself, who I am, so that you have an opportunity to know me, and then share a little bit more about the role of discipleship pastor. So I'm going to let you vote. Which part do you want first? About Whitney or about what the heck a discipleship pastor is? Okay. Then let's do that. My name's Whitney, and as Connie shared, I just finished a tenure of about 10 years serving at Creekwood Christian Church in Flower Mound, Texas. I finished out my time there serving as their senior minister. I was in that role for 5 years, and prior to that, I had served as their minister of faith development and mission. That meant that I oversaw all of our educational and faith formation programming for all ages, children, youth, and adult, and that I also oversaw our community engagement, our outreach, and our missional efforts that we did there with that congregation. My time with Creekwood Christian Church actually began in a summer internship that is a funny story, so I'm going to tell it to you. I was in my final year of graduate school getting my MDiv at Yale Divinity School when Connie was going through my resume just now, trying to help give her some pointers on things that she could say and share about me. When we went over that fact, she said, wait, Yale? The Yale? And it actually reminded me of when I received my letter of acceptance from Yale. I was serving on a spring break mission trip, and so I wasn't home when that letter arrived. And my dad called me and was telling me all of the mail that I had received, a couple of parking tickets from Texas Christian University, where I went for undergrad. But he also said, there's a letter here from Yale. Did you park illegally there also? And I said, I didn't. I actually haven't been yet. That's one of my letters that's coming in to let me know if I got into schools or not. And I said, could you open it for me? And I heard that deep intake of breath on the other side of the phone when someone knows that you have just weighted them with a tremendous responsibility. And my dad said, okay, but whatever it says, you have to promise not to be disappointed. To which I said, thank you for the vote of confidence, Dad. Could you just go ahead and open it, please? And then my dad opened the envelope. Dear Whitney Waller, we are excited to inform you that you have been accepted. And I said, try not to sound too surprised, Dad. That brings me to one of my long life verses, which comes from Philippians 2. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or in vain conceit, but in humility consider others better than yourselves, because there's no one quite like family that can sometimes humble you in the midst of opportunities. I share that story not to make fun of my dad, because he's actually a tremendous cheerleader. I share that story to say I was just as surprised as he was that anybody thought that I would be getting into Yale Divinity School. It was a wonderful time of getting to be in a community that was interdenominational, which was a new world to me. I grew up in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. I went to Texas Christian University. Go Frogs. I spent, how many frogs do we have with us today? All right, that's a good showing. I like it. You don't have to be shy. I know that season didn't end. A lot more in previous years. I was gonna say. I kind of joined up as we were starting to get the hang of that whole football thing. So I'm with you. with you, Mike. But so I had spent a lot of time in a disciples bubble, part of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. And so going off to Yale Divinity School and getting an opportunity to interact with folks from other faith traditions was really transformative for me. Not only other faith traditions that are a part of Christianity, but also with other groups that belong to different religions. And getting to see the ways that our religious backgrounds, even though they're different, there are places of similarity that weave us together and give us an opportunity to do some really incredible work in the communities around us. And so it was with that sense of wanting to share some of the experiences that I had had in the classroom at Yale that I decided that congregational ministry was for me. I had spent a little bit of time wondering if maybe I wanted to go the academic route, to be a professor. Watching you all seated lecture style this morning is letting me know that maybe I made the right choice. It's a little bit easier to do from a pulpit lectern. But it was a really awesome time in my own faith formation of getting to explore so many different parts of my own faith deeply and thinking about the church that raised me, Western Heights Christian Church in Garland, Texas, a church that was full of loving, wonderful, warm people. A church who the lead elder who was in charge of all of Sunday school was my grandmother, Gwen Waller, a place where my desire and love for Christian education was stoked from a very early age. And so going to divinity school and having the opportunity to really dig deeper into that let me know that I wanted to go back and share that knowledge with congregations. I wanted to equip and empower people of all ages to know that our faith is something that we never stop growing in. There was a statistic that was shared, and it's old. It's a little bit older now than what it would contemporarily be. I'm sure it's been about 15 years since the study was done. But in that study, it talked about the fall off in learning that happens in Christian education. And the idea is that either after age of baptism, if you belong in a believer's baptism tradition like we do with the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, or after the age of confirmation, if you belong in a confirmation tradition like the United Church of Christ, Catholicism, Episcopalian Church, after that age of confirmation or baptism, the amount of times that folks attend a Sunday school class offering that is a faith formation offering, an experience outside of what their routine might be, like going to church camp, going to some sort of walk to Emmaus, spiritual formation type things that we see happen, astronomically falls off. Because we've been led to believe that that in some way was this climax in Christian education. Well, I knew enough to be baptized. I knew enough to be confirmed. I know all I need to know. And for me, I lament that, and I think you all do too, I imagine, as a Sunday school class that has been meeting for how many years? 50 plus. For some of you who have been here for much of that time, for some of you who have joined in maybe more in that 5-year range, maybe you are here for the first time today just like me, but because you see and understand the value that Christian education has. And so it was with that I began my own journey in Christian education at Creekwood, a church that, I'm getting back to the funny story, a church that I started out as an intern at because I needed a summer gig back in Texas. While I was at Yale, I was going to be finishing out my final colloquium, is what they called it, of doing supervised ministry. And that supervised ministry was going to happen in my final year, and I was going to be at a really hip, really cool, really cutting-edge dinner church in Brooklyn. A pretentious grad student's dream. They met on Sunday nights, no early mornings, check. I got to ride the train into town, and because it was dinner church, it started with everyone gathering together to make this meal. And as you made the meal, as you set the table, that was part of your worship. That was your call to worship. And then we gathered around tables, and you'd sit at your table, you'd break bread like Jesus did with Jesus' disciples. There would be a lesson that we would go over, and it was just this warm, intimate, beautiful time. It really was an incredible church community doing some amazing ministry in Brooklyn, and I was so excited that their senior pastor, Emily Scott, had allowed me to stalk and coerce her into letting me be her free intern. You think it'd be easy to get free internships, but I tell you what, sometimes. But my plans for that year-long internship started to feel a little bit rocky when my mother received a cancer diagnosis right before the summer of my last year of graduate school, and I knew that I wanted to be home with her during her treatment plan. She is thankfully in full remission this day and is doing really well, but at the time we just weren't sure what the prognosis was going to be. And so Yale was tremendously kind and generous in how they worked with me and said, tell you what, you have 2 weeks to find a church in Texas that will let you do a summer intensive, and then we won't have to worry about your colloquia that was supposed to start in July. And I said, great. So I went to the greatest resource that any pastor has available to them to get a job, Facebook. And I wrote a status update. Hello, who would like a free intern? One of my brother's former camp counselors, a guy by the name of Arthur Stewart, he immediately sent me a message and he said, oh, Creekwood's been looking for somebody. We will take you. And I said, perfect, great. Just let me know when I need to follow up with you. And he said, will do. I'm going to meet with our senior pastor, get it all handled for you. It'll be good. A little bit of time went by. Started to get nervous. Reached out to Arthur, reached out to said senior minister, who called me back a couple days later and said, so Arthur Stewart tells me that he promised you an internship without talking to me first. And I said, did he mention that it's a free internship? And he said, oh, he didn't mention that part. Great, we will see you June 2nd. So I started there as their summer intern, really just sort of doing the things that we're there to do, cleaning out a lot of closets, intern work. Kind of mucking my way through some curriculum and putting things together because they had realized that that was a need they had in their congregation that hadn't been being met. And so at the end of that summer internship, they said, you know what? For as much as we did not know that we wanted or needed that, we kind of liked you being here. How would you like to come back? And so that was what started the time that we spent together, and they're an incredible community. A really, really wonderful church, a wonderful church who saw me through a lot of those growing up stages of life and the things that go along with being a human being as well as a pastor. You all know that, right? That your pastors are also human beings? Yes, to the good and the bad, as it turns out. But we appreciate the ways that you bear with us in that graciously. It's a congregation that I got to walk with through both a marriage and a divorce from the same person. Just to let you know, it's a one-in-a-one deal there. It's a congregation that I had the opportunity to welcome my daughter Josephine into the world and had their tremendous and incredible support when my former spouse decided that he no longer wanted to be a husband or a dad. A congregation that was gracious and kind with me in the midst of seasons of loss in my own family. A congregation who, when we walked through COVID together, was willing to do some pretty wild and outlandish things to help us still feel connected. I'm sure there's stories that your community can tell of that time too, and some of them I've already heard. Some of the stories that we tell are of when our entire staff got a bunch of Halloween costumes, very on sale, but also very COVID-friendly because masks. And then proceeded to go and do a parade in front of every single church member's house over the course of 2 weeks so that they could see kind of us and we could see kind of them and get to have opportunities to connect that way. As we came out of COVID, that church found themselves transformed by the way that community was being woven among them. And they began a process of looking at what it would mean for them to enter into their next phase of ministry. And I helped them oversee that process. And during that process, I had a realization that the work that was mine to do there with them was done. We had checked all of the things that were on our checklist of ways for us to live into our calling together. They had moved from a Sunday school model that really wasn't serving them for a variety of reasons into a small group model, a life group model that empowered them to find times outside of Sunday morning that had just become too hectic, too busy with kids' sports, too much for them to try and fit 3 hours of life with people they really loved into the hour they felt like they only had. We built 3 Habitat for Humanity homes with interfaith partners in a community that's not really known for being tremendously welcoming or inclusive of folks who come from all sorts of different walks and backgrounds in life. Our church was a real place of letting folks know that we wanted to value the difference of our neighbors and learn from them the ways that we can be even better Christians by honoring and celebrating them and doing amazing things together, like providing affordable housing for members in our community. We also had a wonderful time of getting to journey into what's going to be the next phase for them, and that's when I knew that it was time to start telling them goodbye. But part of telling someone goodbye means that you need to figure out who you'd like to say hello to. Typically. Sometimes gap years are allowed, but you heard that story about my dad earlier. That's not really the vibe that I was raised on. So I started thinking about what the next part of my calling would be, the parts of ministry that had been really fulfilling and wonderful for me. And as I focused in on what that was, I really had become passionate about how life groups are a future piece of church life, a place where connection happens, a place where learning and formation happens, where friendships and relationships are deeply formed so that we can be church together. I was tremendously passionate about hospitality and welcome and evangelism. How do we bring new people into our churches? We love to see faces that are familiar to us, that we have seen week after week, year after year, but it's also so exciting to have new people joining us along life's journey, whether that's folks who've recently moved here in the midst of retirement. Maybe it's empty nesters looking to change things up. Maybe it's a new family who's saying, all right, we are getting church back into the schedule and the rhythm of the life that we live. Maybe it's a single person who's hoping that this is the place that they meet a future spouse. Who knows what it is that brings people to church, but looking for what the answer to that is, and then creating spaces of welcome for them so that they can find a church home that's as loving as all the church homes that I have known. And I imagine that that's true for many of you who have spent your life in church. Church is a big part of life. And so as I was thinking of all of those things and trying to discern those next steps in my calling, I also had met a really wonderful guy named Carlos. Some of you, I think, got to meet Carlos last week, and others of you along the way. He's a good guy. We like him. He inconveniently, about 3 months into us dating, took a job in Tulsa. Rude. But thankfully, both mature enough human beings to understand that that would have been a strange juncture for either one of us to say, no, don't go, stay here in Dallas where you don't have a job, and let's just see what happens. So instead, we were long distance for a little over a year between Dallas and Tulsa. Sometimes a very short drive, sometimes a very long one, as I'm sure many of you know, with 4-hour drives to getting to folks that you love and care about. But so part of that discernment journey was figuring out for us how we could be in the same place to continue working on our relationship, for him to continue growing into his relationship with Josie, who does consider him to be her very best friend and favorite playmate. And so in the midst of all of that, I was talking with a mentor and compulsively checking the search and call profile system that we have for clergy, for disciples clergy in the United States, which sometimes is a more effective tool than Facebook, but not always. As was the case in this search, actually. And as I was talking to this colleague, I said, you know, I wish I knew what was going on up in the Tulsa area, would love to know more about the churches there and what's happening. And he said, oh, well, I wonder what's going on at Harvard Avenue. And I said, great question. I've heard wonderful things about them. I know Kevin Howe from being a Bethany Fellow, as well as their former senior minister, Mark Briley. If those are two of the pastors at that church, I can only imagine how incredible that congregation is. And he said, oh, you know what? I know David Emery. I'm going to call him. And I said, oh, you can do that? Great. So this mentor called David, and David said, well, actually, we've got a discipleship pastor position open, and we've been looking for candidates for that with our search team. It's sort of it's a niche position in the Disciples Church. It's one that really focuses on life group formation and forming adult relationships. And they also need to really have a heart for hospitality and evangelism and Christian education and mission and outreach. Do you know anybody? He said, conveniently, I do. And thus unfolded one of those stories of call that I really tell you is one of those times in life that reminds you of just how hard at work the Holy Spirit is when we least expect it. Those conversations started in October and were had in good faith with the search committee, the executive council here. And for those of you who were at the Thanksgiving dinner held in November, you very briefly got to see my grainy face on a screen as I tried to squint at all of you and wave hello after your congregational vote for me to be here. And so I'm so excited to be here with you, to be serving as your discipleship pastor. And so thinking about that, what does that mean? So we're going to pause because I could tell you what it means, but I'm wondering, does anybody have any questions about this discipleship pastor thing? Any questions about the things I just told you about my own personal life? And just coming from Yale, coming from TCU, being with another congregation before here? Or if you want me to keep rolling, I can do that too.
This group always has a question. I'm shocked.
I was just that thorough. No, I will take that to say I had a class in graduate school. It was my Old Testament class, and I'm very much, this podium looks just like that class. And I had a professor, John Collins, who, if you ever open up your New Revised Standard Version Bible, you'll see his name in a lot of places, along with his wife, Adela Yarbrough Collins. So intimidating guy. And as he would talk to us and give us a lecture, he'd hold a coffee cup in his hand, which I get it. I also love coffee. But sometimes when he got really excited, he would start moving his hands so much, and he'd be holding the coffee cup still, and coffee would be one, splashing out. Hilarious. But two, he would realize he needed to stabilize this cup, and so only one of his fingers would start to protrude from the cup while the rest held firmly. And as we're there, he'd say, "Any questions?" "No, none, sir. This is a very threatening stance that you've put us in. Please don't expect us to ask any questions." So if asking in a big space is hard, please come find me at some point following. But I did want to share a little bit about what being the discipleship pastor here at Harvard Avenue means, to share a little bit of my understanding of what that looks like. Serving as the discipleship pastor really means that all of the things that have to do with relationships is the work that is ours to do together. And so those are relationships that we have with God, and those are relationships that we have with each other. So the piece of relationships that we have with God comes under that heading of Christian education and how that's a part of what we do together. It's also a part of missions and the way that we are serving the local community, honoring that commitment that God has placed upon our hearts and an expectation that God has for us as disciples. I did preach a sermon about that last week. If you missed it, no hard feelings. I didn't even know I was preaching it until Saturday. But in sharing what it means for us to serve compassionately, that's one of the places where I'm helping our congregation continue to dig into a deep and rich and beautiful heritage of being a tremendously generous congregation with your time, with your dollars, with your resources, and dreaming of new ways that we can do that. New ways for us as a congregation to stretch us outside of our comfort zone, but also new ways for us to do that allow us to have as many people as possible feeling empowered and encouraged to be a part of that work, and that meet a new need in the world that we see around us, a world that has changed the way that human services are able to happen and we're able to have those interactions. To the piece of the discipleship pastor that has to do with interpersonal relationships and how we create those in the life of church, a big component of that is life groups. In looking at forming life groups, just a quick show of hands, how many folks here are currently involved in a life group that we have at Harvard Avenue Christian Church? I know quite a few in this class belong to life groups. For those of you who didn't raise a hand, you might be thinking, I don't know if I need a life group. I think that I have a lot of folks that I'm connected to here at Harvard Avenue who we've made that commitment to being lifelong friends, and it sounds like all of those pieces that life groups meet have already been met for me. There might also be some of you who are like, you know what? I feel like I've heard people talk about life groups. I still am not sure that I'm totally clear on what those do. I am here to help support and affirm both of those approaches. If you're someone who already feels deeply connected and interwoven into this community, and you feel like you have found your people, good news. You have an organic life group. You might not have a time that you've set weekly or monthly for that group to meet, but if that's your go-to text chain, phone tree, email chain, that's your life group. If that life group of folks would benefit from having some support that comes from, you know what, our group's wanting to commit to praying together more often. Whitney, do you have any resources you can provide for helping us do that together? I'm your gal. If that group is looking for ways that they can maybe volunteer or serve together, come find me. If you're in that category of saying, I've heard life groups mentioned and I'm really not sure what they are, please know you are so not alone. It is a term that can feel really jargony and disconnected from who we are or what we need. But really, at the heart of what a life group is it's a way for folks to find connection, belonging, and a space where they get to go a little bit deeper in their relationship with God because they trust that they can be their authentically true selves in that life group. There are some different ways that we make that happen, and you're going to be hearing a whole lot more about that in the next couple of weeks as we jump into Lent, because kind of combining all those things together, this is me wrapping up, we are going to be launching a church-wide Lenten invitation. It's a Lenten prayer guide and a Lenten study that's going to go along with the series that we're going to have in worship for the season of Lent. It's a series entitled Hunger and Thirst, and I've been working with Kevin and David to format a 40-day prayer journal that has us reading through Scripture daily, one of those core practices for us here at Harvard Avenue, but it also has a life group component. There are going to be some life groups that are going to be meeting on Wednesdays. There are new life groups that we're starting to form for people to get a 6-week glimpse of what life group looks like, because it's one of those things that I could explain until I'm blue in the face, and it gives you some sense of what it is, but until you've really put into practice and had the opportunity to commit yourself to meeting with folks, to commit yourself to a group of people that you've said, you know what, I want us to be partners on this journey as church together, I don't know that you quite grasp all of the power and the wonder that it holds for how it really transforms the relationships we have with each other, the relationships we have with God, and the relationships that you get to have together as a church as a whole. So that's a big part of what I'm doing. And then on top of that, some evangelism, some hospitality, helping us figure out all of the ways that we help people feel welcomed warmly into this space and like it's a place that they can belong. So some of that is the really easy nuts and bolts pieces of, hey, did you know that signs help people know where the sanctuary is versus the baptistry? Which if Jim Boswell has never told you the story of when he fell into the baptistry thinking he was walking into the sanctuary, please ask him for it. Also know that I will give him full credit when I continue to use that story shamelessly everywhere to advocate for better signage. It's not just the nuts and bolts pieces of things though, and explaining what we do when we're in worship together, those things we sometimes take for granted when we've been around church for a long time. But it's also thinking about how we create pathways for people from the first time they visit to find themselves feeling like this is a place that they could call home for the next 40 years. Sometimes we have a habit, especially I know for me as a person who has been around church all 35 years of my life, who can pretty easily find my way around the most mysterious of buildings, and really has a pretty easy time fitting in with folks and going ahead and making myself welcome. Sometimes we as church take that for granted, and we don't always make that easy for people to go from first day to first week to first month to first year. We just sort of carry an expectation of, well, we're all really great. We know we're really great, so you belong here now. Okay, figure it out. And so my job is to help us architect that pathway that lets people feel as comfortable and at home here as so many of you do as such foundational pillars of Harvard Avenue. So that's really all I've got. Do you have any, I don't know how we're doing on time. Okay, I was going to say, do we have any questions? Yes, and I'll try to read name tags. Cheryl, hi.
How do you put people in a group? How do you determine who's going to be in what group and how many people?
I love that question. Thank you, Cheryl. I wasn't going to try to take us too far into the nuts and bolts of it all, but so there are 2 ways that we are looking at forming life groups at Harvard Avenue. So the first really speaks to what I described in that organic scenario of there are folks that I've really already connected with and like, those are my people here. We have been each other's people for a long time. That's an organic life group. Or maybe it's not we've been each other's people for a long time. Maybe it's you're someone who has said, you know what? I feel like I have the gifts and skills needed to host a life group, which that's a really important word. Hosting is a little bit different than leading, and we can get into that later, but it's not this sense of you have to have some deep biblical knowledge or profound sense of your own spiritual life to host a life group. It's really like, hey, I know how to text people. I know how to send an email. I know how to write meetings down in my calendar and maybe share reminders with people and tell them what I'd like for them to bring and find someone to host that. It's things that you've probably done other places and then watching that organically happen. So for folks who have said, I'd love to lead a life group and I think I know some people who would be really ready to do that together, that's the first way that we're doing that. And we're thinking of that as more of an organic formation of life groups, and that's how most of our life groups to date have been formed. The second way that we're forming life groups, there is actually a form that went out a couple of weeks ago, and you'll be seeing it a lot coming across in your emails. It's also, I think it's on the bulletin this week, that's saying, hey, would you like to sign up for a life group? And that is more like an online dating profile. Don't get scared. Don't get scared. That one is more you saying, hey, I'm interested and willing, should the stars align and the time is right. So that comes to me, it's a very limited bit of information. It's really just sharing your name, letting me know what time of day works for you, how often you'd like a life group to meet, and then days of the week that you're available. And then I'm culminating a spreadsheet and following up with folks to help with fit and feel of forming groups. So when I say fit and feel, I mean that to say that I'm not going to ask the person who said, I would love for my group to meet weekly and be a co-ed group because I love that diversity of perspective that comes from having both genders represented. And I would love for us to be meeting on Saturday evenings. I'm not going to say to that person, hey, the group I'm putting you in is going to be a women's Bible study that meets on Monday mornings at 9 a.m., and they're just going to meet quarterly. That's going to fulfill your needs, right? So it's about looking at all of the different bits and pieces of that. So those are the 2 ways that we're going about forming groups right now. And you also might be hearing from me just as I'm calling around, introducing myself to people, and encouraging folks who might not already belong to a life group to consider joining a life group. Please don't take that as a pointed at you, like I really think you could use this. I think everyone could use this, and so my goal is to try and connect as many folks as possible with the opportunity and help familiarize and make us a little bit more comfortable with what that means. So thank you so much for a great question, Cheryl. Yes?
What is the church and what is your mission to try to reach out to more minority groups in the church, members of the congregation?
Sure. So what is the church's mission in doing that, or?
Well, I don't see, when I look around, I don't see very many minorities here.
So I just want to make sure I'm answering your question to the best of my ability. Are you thinking of minority in maybe a traditional sense of thinking about ethnicity and race? Is that the ethnicity and race? That's a great question. Thank you. I just wanted to make sure. Sometimes folks have asked me a question like that, and I start answering like, well, let's talk about that. And then they're like, no, I just meant that it would be cool if there were more 20-year-olds. Because they can feel like a minority in churches sometimes, which is also a thing that we're doing. So for me personally, I think that one of the things that really drew me to Harvard Avenue was thinking about what it means for us to practice radical hospitality and authentic community, and how those are a part of a mission and vision that we share as church. When we think about church, one of the things that I like to say is that church is supposed to be that practice, that rehearsal, that glimpse of the kingdom of God in real time that we get each time we're together. And I think a big part of that, knowing that our God created the world to be diverse, created the world to be beautiful and full of so many different folks, means that we want to see that diversity reflected in our community. And so we wonder, when we don't see it, how are ways that we can do a better job of seeing that diversity reflected? And so for me, some of the ways that I hope to see us leaning into and sitting with that question, and then hopefully bearing the fruit that comes with having sat with that question in really prayerful ways, is that we think about, what are we doing as a congregation that lets folks who maybe don't look like us, aren't in the circles that maybe I'm in all of the time, what lets them know that this is a place for them? If I'm not interacting with people in my everyday life who belong to groups if I'm not interacting with people in my everyday life who don't look just like me, how do I expect to invite any of them to church with me? Because I'm not really having an opportunity to have authentic community with them. And then another piece of that is to think about, how ready am I to let folks be a part of this community and authentically be themselves? Which I think that this is a congregation that's so welcoming and so friendly, and I haven't been here long enough to tell any stories on you yet. But I can tell you a story of, we had a family that started visiting with us at the church I served in Flower Mound, Texas, which does sound like a very made-up place. It is real, I promise. But we had a family start visiting with us at Flower Mound, and we were a predominantly white congregation. And when I say predominantly white, I mean like 90%. So a big predominantly white. And this family that started meeting with us, they were African American, had joined our church coming from a Pentecostal background. And so coming from that Pentecostal background, their worship experience was very lively and beautiful and animated. A lot of hands waving in the air, a lot of call and response, which I will tell you as a pastor, love it. Can't get enough of it. Love a talk back. But for the rest of the frozen chosen, joining us on Sunday morning, very still while we're worshiping, I had some folks who shared with me, like, that's a little bit of a distraction for me. That's a little hard for me. But then I also had that family share, we feel like we're being a distraction in worship. Well, what has you feeling that way? Well, nobody sits by us anymore. And so it's thinking about, what are the ways that we are creating a space for all that comes with diversity, right? Because it's not just about seeing a different palette or different colors. It's about seeing all that diversity brings and how we get to be church together. And so I think that already the congregation has taken a tremendous step in talking about radical hospitality and authentic community being values that we hold, because that means that we have a shared vision and mission statement and guiding values that say, this is a place where you're going to be welcome however you worship, wherever you have been from, whatever your background is, we're going to find ways to celebrate what worshiping God looks like together. So that's the beginning of a really big answer, but thank you for that question. That was great. Yes, Jack.
Kind of along those lines, I spent a little time this morning watching 2 news shows on TV, and I'm always, as I watch those, thinking, that's crazy. How can I change that? What can I do? And with church groups, how do you see the role of the church in politics? Or you a real hard line saying that there is no role for your one?
Thanks, Jack. That's a great question. I am a really big believer, so here's my thing. We live in a world where, in my ideal, our lives are lived entirely and guided by the teachings of Jesus Christ. That would be wonderful for me. 1, because that world looks like the kingdom of God. 2, it means that the way that we've chosen to operate and live and function is from this faith perspective, instead of a faith perspective that I understand, a faith perspective that I am at home in, a faith perspective that I would never dare to say that I'm an expert in, but I at least feel like I have a little bit of a grip and a grasp on what that looks like. For us, that's not the world that we live in. We do live in a world where some of what we see in what makes secular life happen and possible for us is grounded in faith perspectives of those who have come before us. Some of it is grounded in some respect by faith perspectives that the folks who have been voted into office say are important to them and matter to them. The reality is our faith and politics do intersect and interact with each other. Now, the way that they intersect and act with each other, I think, is a really important thing for us to think about. Something that a professor said to me in school that has really stuck with me is that Jesus was political. Political in the sense that Jesus had really big concerns, questions, and desires for how people were taken care of, how the people were governed. But Jesus was never partisan. And so when we live in a society like ours, where we so often see faith being invoked to encourage or support partisan politics, that's a really big non-starter for me as a pastor. I think that's probably why you hear a lot of pastors say that politics and faith really have no business mixing. It's because so much of the language of our faith has been co-opted into political language. In my former congregation, I had a couple of times that folks belonging to both of our primary political parties here in the United States would come to me and say, I really did not like that sermon that you preached on Sunday. You made Jesus sound like a Republican. Or, I really did not like that sermon you preached on Sunday. You made Jesus sound like a Democrat. There you go. When you hear it both ways, that tends to be a good guiding force, right? But also, it's really a really helpful place to say, I'd love for you to tell me what you heard that sounded like politics, and then to be able to bring them back to Scripture and say, I may have been talking about a social event, because that's a part of our life too, right? We want our pastors, we want our churches to be a place where we talk about the world around us, because this is a place we come to make sense of it. But never do I believe in doing that from a place that you would have an idea of like, oh, well, Whitney just told us who to vote for. Or, oh, well, Whitney just told us how to, what our stance should be on an issue. Because I don't think that that's the work that we're being called to do. The work that we're being called to do is hold each other in community and in those questions and in the tension that creates, so that we are all thinking and reevaluating how not just our politics, but every aspect of our life is shaped by our faith. So I hope that's helpful, Jack. Yes. I was going to end with that, Janet. Yes. So the last piece I was going to say, Janet's like, please mention the thing I've been so helpful with. Because Janet and Ray have been my guiding angels. Stars in the night for me, if you will. One of the big things that goes along with that hospitality piece, and it's the place where the nuts and bolts and some of the theological pieces of that meet, is donut and coffee fellowship. How many of you have ever benefited from donut and coffee fellowship? I have. My child may have benefited a little too much this morning from Donut and Coffee Fellowship. So Donut and Coffee Fellowship is one of those things that falls under that hospitality umbrella for me. And it's also one of those places that I'm really working on how we see that as a theological opportunity to welcome folks, to share about what's going on with our groups. And so I'm extending to you all an invitation, a class that I imagine is very well versed in how Donut and Coffee Fellowship happens. As we're working on volunteer recruitment and management and getting more folks involved and plugged in, Donut Fellowship is one of the places that we're starting with that, of getting folks who are getting life groups to serve together, getting Sunday school classes to have members who are serving together, to diversify who folks are seeing at Donut and Coffee Fellowship, overseeing that. One, so that you can meet people who are a part of the church who might not be in your Sunday school class or sit next to you in worship. Two, so that you can share about great things that are going on. Maybe you all have a great series of speakers who are coming in and you'd love for the congregation to know about that as an event. What better way than the place you are guaranteed to have people stop by and chat with you for a second, to have a sign out that says, Coffee and Donut Fellowship, brought to you by the Challengers class. Think about joining us next week. So with that, I hear people already gathering out there. I should probably pray with you, so you get to go do that too. But if you are thinking, I am convicted, Whitney, I would love to sign up for Donut and Coffee Fellowship, have I got the sign-up sheet for you? And I'm going to put it right over here on this table. But thank you so much for letting me be with y'all today. Is it okay if I conclude our time together in the spirit of prayer? Let's pray. Holy and gracious God, we give thanks for these saints of your congregation who are a part of the life of Harvard Avenue Christian Church. I thank you this morning, oh God, especially for the warm and gracious welcome that I have received and getting to come and share with them, to share about me, to share about my passion for you, to share about the hopes that I have for discipleship ministry here at Harvard Avenue. God, I look forward to seeing the ways that you continue to be at work in us, your vision, your mission, your values, and your practices unfolding as we continue to journey together. Amen. Thanks, y'all.